Hello and welcome. In this lecture, I will discuss about the life, environment, and the works of the great Greek philosopher Plato. Dear friends, the great Greek philosopher Plato was born in 427 BC in Athens, Greece, in a very noble family. His father Ariston boastfully traced his ancestry to the early kings of Athens, and Plato's mother, Perictyon, was a descendant of Solon, the famous lawgiver of Athens. Plato's original name was Aristocles, which in Greek language means best or renowned. But because of being broad-shouldered, he was nicknamed as Plato. And it was probably due to this nickname that he was destined to be immortalized as the most talked and written about philosopher since antiquity. As with many young boys of Hellas, Plato was probably taught by some of Athens' finest educators. The curriculum would have featured the doctrines of Cratylus and Pythagoras, as well as Parmenides. These probably helped develop the foundation for Plato's study of metaphysics and epistemology. Plato was known for his good looks and charming disposition. He excelled in the study of mathematics, rhetoric, music, and poetry. As a young man, Plato had nurtured political ambitions, but as a result of few incidents, he altogether changed his course in life. In his work, The Seventh Letter, presumed to be his autobiography, he admits that as a young man, I thought that the very moment I attained my majority, I should engage in public affairs, as politics and I were a fit match. But Plato witnessed two major events that set his course in life. One was the steep rise and the tragic fall of the legendary Greek philosopher Socrates. The other significant event was the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, in which Athens was miserably defeated and it lost all of whatever was left of its past glory and prestige. At the end of the Peloponnesian War, two of Plato's close relatives, Critias and Charmides, led a group of oligarchs who overthrew their stee's democracy and ruled as the notorious 30 tyrants, involving in all sorts of misrule for 9 months. They even asked Plato to join them. But Plato writes, their behavior was such that my blood boiled at it. For as I looked, I saw those men in a short time make the former democratic government seem like a golden age. After the end of 9 months, when this oligarchy of 30 tyrants was overthrown and democracy was restored, Plato briefly considered a career in politics. But the execution of Socrates in 399 BC soured him on this idea, and he turned to a life of study and philosophy. The unfair trial and the tragic execution of Socrates in 399 BC proved to be a real turning point in Plato's life. At that time, Plato was just 28 years of age, and being an apologist of Socrates, he was greatly shaken by the incident. In utter desperation, Plato left Athens for Megara and then went on to travel to Cyrene, Italy, Sicily, and even perhaps Egypt. While in Syracuse in 387 BC, he became the instructor to Dion, brother-in-law of the tyrant Dionysius I. At some later time, Dionysius became annoyed with Plato and tried to sell him into slavery. Somehow he escaped from Syracuse and conceded his failure in transforming a tyrant into a philosopher king. He returned back to Athens and eventually founded the academy, where he taught for the rest of his life. In 386 BC, on returning to Athens, Plato established his academy, which later became a seat of higher learning and intellectual pursuits in Greece for so many centuries. Plato saw in the academy a training school for future philosopher rulers. The republic composed by Plato in the academy served as its prospectus. Through the academy, Plato kept alive the Socratic legacy. Teaching in the academy was imparted through lectures, Socratic dialectics, and problem-solving situations. At the entrance of the academy was written, "No one without the knowledge of mathematics may enter here." In this insistence on the discipline of exact study, Plato's academy can be called the first of Western university. It might be regarded as the first university in this too, that it strived to provide men who, nurtured by their academic training, would become future philosophers, lawgivers, statesmen, and the leaders of their communities. The academy, like the Pythagorean school, also admitted women. Mathematics, which included arithmetic and advanced geometry, astronomy, music, law, and philosophy, were the main subjects for study. Plato spent the rest of his life at the academy, teaching and instructing, organizing and managing the academy. Of all the students, Aristotle was the greatest pupil of Plato in the academy. Plato died in 347 BC, leaving behind a great corpus and legacy of philosophy named as Platonism, about which one of his famous critique, Karl Popper, remarks that Western thought, one might say, has been either Platonic or anti-Platonic, but hardly ever non-Platonic. C.L. Vapor, in his political thought, while commenting on the environment that shaped Plato and his philosophy, writes that Plato opened his eyes as a mature man in Athens when it was going through a turbulent time in its history. Born 1 year after the death of Pericles in Athens, which was still the greatest of Greek polis. The educator of Hellas, Sophocles, was then at the height of his power. Aristophanes was beginning to entrance the demos. The Parthenon had been finished but 10 years before. But it was in the Athens from which virtue was passing that he grew up. An Athens strained in the Peloponnesian War. An Athens where democracy was beginning to pass into those extremist forms which he so mercilessly satirized. He was a schoolboy when the great expedition sailed to disaster at Syracuse. He was a young man of 23 years when defeat ended the war and the democracy in Athens fell. Above all, it was the death of Socrates that turned him from active politics to speculative philosophy. In his contemporary world, Plato saw stasis everywhere, cities so divided that their citizens stood in the posture of gladiators. He saw unrighteousness rampant and injustice enthroned. He saw ignorance supreme and parading up and down in the guise of knowledge. And he saw everywhere, too, the predicament in which men found themselves, doing what their nature suggested to them. They found not what they sought, but turmoil and strife, and agony and death. This was so because to be mistaken seemed part of their very nature, and they were not corrected by those who led them. Even the best of these were unhelpful. Since the root cause of contemporary human predicament was located by Plato in the leadership by ignorant men who pretend to be knowledgeable. Hence, Plato puts forward the much needed solution by contending that I was compelled to say, in praising true philosophy, that it was from it alone that one was able to discern all true justice, public and private. And so I said that the nations of men will never cease from trouble until either the true and genuine breed of philosophers shall come to political office, or until that of the rulers in states shall by some divine ordinance take to the true pursuit of philosophy. Socrates, whom the oracle at Delphi had pronounced to be the wisest of mankind, was regarded by Plato as the best of men. He came under the influence of Socrates while as a young man of 20 years of age, and was obviously very deeply influenced by him and by his method of inquiry, that is the Socratic method of inquiry. This method was based on a kind of a debate in which the aim was to demolish the opponent's position by exposing logical flaws in the arguments. Very little is reliably known about Socrates. He apparently lived from 470 to 399 BC, during the Athenian golden age of Pericles, and then during the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. Socrates himself never wrote down any of his ideas, but rather engaged his young followers in endless discussions. Plato reconstructed these discussions in a great set of writings known as the Dialogues, questioning all whom he could induce to listen to him, so that he might arrive at truth, and incidentally exposing the pretensions and revealing the inadequacies of those who claimed to have found it. Socrates was the gadfly of Athens. Socrates wasn't loved by everyone. His unorthodox political and religious views gave the leading citizens of Athens the excuse they needed to sentence him to death for corrupting the morals of the youth of the city. In 399 BC, he was ordered by the then Athenian government to drink a brew of poison called hemlock, which he did publicly in the company of all his friends and foes. Instead of yielding, he preferred a heroic death for the sake of his cherished principles, leaving behind this often quoted example till eternity. This historical event is sensationalized by Plato in his famous work, The Apology. Plato, being a disciple of Socrates for almost 8 years, had undoubtedly a great regard and respect for the wit, the courage, and the knowledge of his teacher. The Socratic doctrine that virtue is knowledge became the cornerstone of Plato's philosophy. Socrates is the main protagonist of Plato's Dialogues. From Socrates, Plato learned the dialectical method of study and discovery of truth. But unlike his teacher, Plato did not indulge in mere discourses on the streets of Athens. Rather, he went a step ahead and not only started his famous academy, but also composed his numerous works that have fortunately been preserved for the posterity. Plato left behind a great literary corpus, which comprises of about 35 of his writings that mostly take the form of dialogues, often with Socrates as the main character. The dialogues have been divided into 3 groups according to the probable order of their composition. The earliest group of dialogues, called Socratic dialogues, are the Apology, Crito, Laches, Charmides, Euthyphro, Hippias Minor, Ion, and Protagoras. Lysis, Cratylus, Georgias, Hippias Major, Minizinus, Meno, Phaedo, and Symposium. The great dialogues of his middle years, the Republic, Parmenides, Theaetetus, and Phaedrus. The late dialogues devoted to technical philosophical issues. The most important of these are the Timaeus, Critias, Sophist, Statesman, Philebus, and the Laws. Of all his works, the Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws are of perennial interest to all those interested in the history of political philosophy. By far, the most prominent work of Plato is the Republic. Believed to be written around 386 BC, it is the composition of all the mature ideas of Plato. Benjamin Jowett, in the introduction to his very famous translation of Plato's Republic, points out 5 natural divisions in it. According to him, the first division of the Republic comprises of Book 1 and the first half of Book 2 as introductory. The first book containing a refutation of the popular and sophist notions of justice and concluding like some of the earlier dialogues without arriving at any definite result. To this is appended a restatement of the nature of justice according to common opinion, and an answer is demanded to the question, what is justice stripped of appearances? The second division includes the remainder of the Book 2, the Book 3 and Book 4, which are mainly occupied with the construction of the first state and the first education. The third division consists of the Book 5, Book 6 and Book 7, in which philosophy rather than justice is the subject of inquiry. And the second state is constructed on the principles of communism and ruled by philosophers, and the contemplation of the idea of good takes the place of the social and political virtues. In the fourth division are books 8 and 9, in which the perversions of states and of the individuals who correspond to them are revived in succession, and the nature of pleasure and the principle of tyranny are further analyzed in the individual man. The fifth division has Book 10. It is the conclusion of the whole, in which the relations of philosophy to poetry are finally determined, and the happiness of the citizens in this life, which has now been assured, is crowned by the vision of another. The real importance of the Republic lies in Book 2 to Book 8. The principal characters in the Republic are Cephalus, Polemarchus, Thrasymachus, Socrates, Glaucon and Eudaimentus. Cephalus appears in the introduction only. Polemarchus drops at the end of the first argument, and the Thrasymachus is reduced to silence at the close of the first book. The main discussion is carried on by Socrates, Glaucon and Eudaimentus, and the author of the entire dialogue is Plato. Plato is believed to have deliberately constructed his early dialogues as aporetic, not only to give us a picture of the historical Socrates, but also in order to use these dialogues to create a setting for his own philosophical position in the Republic. The Republic represents the acme of Plato's philosophy, and in a way is the center of all his dialogues. In its sweep, comprehension, perfection and universality of thought, it shows Hellenic philosophy at its best. It gives a picture not of any existing state in Greece, but of an ideal state in which the apparent weaknesses and shortcomings of the existing states were to be avoided. The Platonic ideal was not a creature of imagination, but an idea perfected by speculation and logic, experience and test, comparison and criticism. The Republic of Plato is more than a treatise on politics. It deals with economics, ethics, psychology, education and metaphysics. Its range of subject matter includes the whole of human life. Though the Republic is critical of the contemporary political practice and actual state system, its object is to reform the existing social and political defects. Plato holds out before us the vision of the ideal state and the way to realize it, with a view to correcting the social and political deformities. In the Republic, the aim of Plato is not to describe what the polis is, but what it should be. An ideal serves as a standard of measurement, a standard by which we measure the actual. Though an ideal cannot be realized, it can enable us to understand the real. The ideal state and the principles lying at the root of the ideal state are still with us. They serve us as the standard with which we may judge the phenomena of actual politics. This is the great function of the republic as well as its value. Plato shows us what the state would be if its eminent principles were fully realized. By revealing this, Plato reveals to us the truth and thereby enables us to understand the state. Professor George Sabine, in his History of Political Theory, says that the fundamental ideal of the republic came to Plato in the form of his master's doctrine that virtue is knowledge. The proposition that virtue is knowledge implies that there is an objective good to be known, and it can in fact be known by rational or logical investigation rather than by intuition, guesswork or luck. The good is objectively real, whatever anybody thinks about it, and it ought to be realized, not because men want it, but because it is good. Thus, Plato constructs in the Republic an ideal state by depicting what in principle the state ought to be. He actually gave the idea of an ideal state, not worrying about the practicality of the idea. In his construction of an ideal state in Republic, whose subtitle is concerning justice, he begins with the doctrine of idea or form. The doctrine of idea leads him to the conclusion that ideal is real, and on this premise he constructs his ideal state based on the highest virtue of justice. After rejecting the then prevailing and dominant notions of justice in his own times, he puts forward his own conception of justice. In his quest for justice, he turns away from the visible and external realities of the world and turns inward towards the mind of man to see justice. This is the great step that Plato took, and herein lies his permanent contribution to the political thought. Here we may conclude the first part of the lecture, in which I tried to explain the life, environment, and works of the great Greek philosopher Plato. That's all for now. Thank you very much for being with me.